He was 16 years old when he took the wrong turn, and at the time, it felt like nothing more than a small decision made in a quiet moment. There was no dramatic music, no sudden warning, no instinct screaming at him to stop. It was just a fork in the road, a pause in his steps, and a choice made because he was tired, hungry, and eager to get home before nightfall. In another world, in another time, that wrong turn would have meant nothing at all. But in occupied Europe, in the middle of a war that swallowed entire families without warning, a wrong turn could erase your name from the earth. By the summer of 1943, the boy had already learned things no 16-year-old should ever have to understand. He had learned how to walk without making noise. He had learned how to read faces quickly and decide whether to speak or stay silent. He had learned that fear was not always loud, and that the most dangerous moments were often the quietest ones. The war had aged him faster than time ever could, carving seriousness into his eyes and caution into every movement he made. Childhood had not ended for him with a celebration or a milestone. It had ended slowly, day by day, as people disappeared and never came back. His father had vanished 2 years earlier. German soldiers had arrived early in the morning, boots heavy against the stone floor, voices firm but polite in the way that made fear worse. They said his father was needed for questioning. They said it would not take long. They said many things that morning. None of them were true. His father never returned, and no official record ever explained where he had gone. After that day, his mother became quieter, and the house felt larger, emptier, as if the walls themselves were waiting for bad news to arrive. That morning, she handed him a small cloth bag with bread wrapped carefully inside. Her hands lingered for a moment longer than usual as she passed it to him, as if she wanted to memorize the feeling of his fingers. She told him where to go and reminded him which roads to avoid. Her voice steady but tight, the way it always was when she was afraid. He nodded, promised he would be careful, and stepped outside, unaware that this would be the last normal promise he would ever make. The road was familiar at first, a narrow stretch of dirt, bordered by trees that had watched generations grow up and disappear. He walked quickly, head down, senses sharp, listening for engines, voices, or the sudden crack of boots on gravel. In occupied territory, silence was never comforting. Silence meant soldiers were near, or that people were hiding, or that something terrible had already happened. Even the birds seemed to understand this, their songs absent as if the forest itself was afraid to draw attention. He walked. His thoughts drifted between the task ahead and the home he had left behind. He thought about how little bread they had left and how carefully his mother rationed every slice. He thought about the neighbor who had asked him to deliver the message, speaking in hushed tones as if the walls could hear. The paper folded inside his bag was thin, but its meaning was heavy. Names, places, warnings. The kind of information that could save lives if delivered on time, or destroy them if found by the wrong hands. Then he reached the crossroads. For narrow paths stretched out before him, each disappearing into trees and uncertainty. The wooden signpost standing at the center leaned awkwardly, its markings faded and scratched, some deliberately ruined so no one could be sure where they led. He stopped there longer than he should have, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, glancing up at the sky where clouds moved faster than he expected. He remembered the instructions he had been given, remembered the longer route that was safer but slower. And then he looked at the shorter path to his left, the one he had never taken before. It was just a shortcut, he told himself. Just a few minutes saved. He thought about his mother waiting, about the bread growing cold, about the risk of being outside after dark. He did not think about headquarters or soldiers or command centers hidden deep within forests. He did not think about death. He turned left. Almost immediately, the road felt different beneath his feet. The dirt gave way to gravel, and the trees grew thinner, allowing more light to break through the canopy. There was a strange stillness in the air, an unnatural order that did not belong in a forest. His pace slowed without him realizing it, his instincts uneasy, his chest tightening as he noticed. Thin wires stretched between trees at irregular intervals. His heart began to pound, each beat louder than the last, as understanding crept in too late. Then he heard voices. They were close, speaking German with calm authority, the kind of confidence that came from knowing you controlled the ground you stood on. He froze, breath caught in his throat, body pressed against the trunk of a tree as boots crushed gravel nearby. He listened to fragments of conversation about schedules and supplies, about routine matters spoken with casual certainty. These were not men passing through. These were men who belonged here. When he carefully looked ahead, his stomach dropped. Hidden beyond the trees was something far larger than a patrol or a temporary post. Buildings stood in deliberate formation. Vehicles lined up with mechanical precision. Antennas rising above the forest like silent sentinels. Guards stood at their positions with relaxed alertness, weapons held as extensions of their bodies. There was no barbed wire at the perimeter, no dramatic warning signs, because none were necessary. This place did not expect visitors. It did not expect mistakes. He had walked straight into a Nazi headquarters. The realization struck him like a physical blow, leaving his legs weak and his thoughts scrambling. This was a place where orders were written that erased villages, where names were crossed off lists, where lives were reduced to symbols on maps. And he was standing there with a cloth bag, a folded message, and fear threatening to betray him with every breath. He should have run. He knew that. Every part of him screamed to turn and sprint back into the forest. Consequences be damned. But running would mean guilt, and guilt would mean questions. And questions in a place like this often ended with a bullet. So he stood still. A single voice cut through the air behind him. Just one word, sharp and commanding. He turned slowly to face a young German soldier whose rifle was not aimed but ready, whose expression shifted from surprise to suspicion in seconds. The soldier asked what he was doing there. The boy answered carefully, choosing words that felt safe, saying he was delivering bread. The soldier looked at the bag, then at the boy's thin frame, then down the road he had come from, his eyes narrowing as doubt settled in. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then the soldier gestured for him to follow. They searched him but did not strike him. They took the bag, unfolded the bread, glanced at the paper without understanding its meaning. They let him pass guards and officers who barely spared him a glance. Because to them, he was insignificant, just a child who had wandered where he did not belong. They did not realize that sometimes history enters quietly, wearing the face of a frightened 16-year-old who made a simple mistake. Inside the main building, the air was heavy with the smell of paper, metal, and human tension. Maps covered the walls, marked and remarked with lines that decided the fate of thousands. Phones rang endlessly, officers moved with purpose, and the machinery of war operated with terrifying efficiency. The boy stood in the center of it all, trying to remain invisible, trying not to let his fear spill out in a way that would seal his fate. A senior officer approached him, older and composed, his calm more unsettling than anger would have been. He asked questions in a measured tone, switching languages effortlessly, watching the boy's face more than his answers. When he finally spoke again, he said something the boy would remember for the rest of his life. He said the boy had taken a wrong turn, and then added, almost thoughtfully, that sometimes the road chooses for you. In that moment, the boy did not yet understand that his mistake had placed him at the center of something far larger than himself. He did not know that what happened next would echo far beyond that forest, beyond that headquarters, and beyond the war itself. He only knew that he was 16 years old, standing inside the enemy's heart, and that there was no way back to the boy he had been that morning. The hours that followed felt unreal to him, as if time itself had slowed inside those walls. He was placed on a wooden chair in a narrow room with bare walls and a single window covered by thin curtains. Light slipped through in weak lines, dust floating in the air like suspended thoughts. No one spoke to him at first. No one explained what would happen next. That silence pressed on him harder than shouting ever could. He stared at his hands, at the dirt under his nails, at the faint tremor in his fingers that refused to stop no matter how hard he tried to control it. He thought about the paper that had been in his bag. He did not know if they had understood its meaning, but he knew enough to realize that even a small mistake could expose others. Faces came to his mind one by one, neighbors, friends, people who trusted him because he was young and therefore less noticeable. The guilt settled heavy in his chest, a slow-burning fear that maybe his wrong turn had already destroyed lives he would never know about. He wondered if his mother could feel it, wherever she was, that something had gone terribly wrong. Footsteps eventually echoed in the hallway, deliberate and unhurried. The door opened, and the same officer returned, carrying a folder under his arm. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice. He sat across from the boy and placed the folder on the table between them, as if this were a conversation between equals. That calm was what terrified the boy the most. He had seen anger before. He had seen violence. Calm meant calculation. The officer asked again where he was going and why. This time, the questions were slower, more detailed. The boy answered carefully, repeating the story of delivering bread, of helping his mother, of choosing the wrong road. Each answer felt like stepping on thin ice, unsure which word might cause it to crack. The officer listened without interrupting, watching closely, not for lies but for hesitation, for fear, for patterns. At one point, the officer leaned back and studied him silently, as if weighing something invisible. He said that many boys his age were fighting already, dying already, and that it was strange to see one wandering alone with bread and messages. The boy did not respond. He had learned that silence was sometimes the safest answer. The officer smiled faintly, not unkindly, and said that war had a way of forcing people into roles they never chose. What the boy did not realize was that this was not an interrogation, meant to extract information. It was an evaluation. They were deciding what he could be used for. After a while, he was escorted out again, this time into a larger room, where several officers stood, around a table covered in maps. They spoke over him as if he were not there, discussing troop movements, supply routes, resistance activity. Names of towns he recognized were mentioned casually, like pieces on a board. Hearing them spoken that way made his stomach turn. These were places where people lived, where children slept, where life still tried to continue despite everything. One officer pointed to a location on the map, not far from the village the boy came from. The boy's breath caught, though he forced his face to remain still. He understood then how close everything was, how thin the line had been between his ordinary morning and complete disaster. If he had arrived just a little earlier or later, if a different officer had stopped him, the outcome might already have been sealed. Eventually, they led him outside again, not back toward the forest, but deeper into the compound. He noticed how everything functioned with efficiency, how soldiers moved with purpose rather than urgency. This place was not reacting to the war. It was directing it. That realization changed something inside him. Fear was still there, but beneath it grew a quiet awareness that what he had stumbled into mattered, far beyond his own survival. They gave him water, then bread. That simple act confused him more than cruelty would have. As he ate, hands still shaking, the officer spoke again, this time more casually, asking about his village, about who lived there, about daily routines. The questions seemed harmless, but the boy sensed the danger beneath them. He answered vaguely, careful not to offer details that could be used later. Every word felt like a step through a minefield. The officer eventually told him that he would not be punished for his mistake. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, but it was followed by suspicion. In war, mercy was rarely free. The officer explained that the boy would stay for a short time, that they needed help with small tasks, errands, translation. A boy like him, young and unassuming, attracted less attention. The implication was clear even if it was never spoken aloud. That night, the boy lay on a narrow cot in a shared room, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Around him, soldiers breathed deeply, exhausted from their work. He listened to the rhythm of the place, to the distant hum of generators and muffled conversations. He thought about escape, about running the moment he was given the chance. But he also understood how closely he was being watched. He was no longer just a lost child. He was an asset. Days passed, and his presence became strangely normal. He carried papers from one building to another, delivered food, cleaned rooms. He learned which officers spoke harshly and which spoke softly. He learned when to keep his head down and when to make himself useful. All the while, he listened. He observed. He memorized. The same skills that had kept him alive in occupied territory now allowed him to absorb information. Without drawing attention, he began to understand the layout of the headquarters, the patterns of patrols, the timing of meetings. He learned which rooms were avoided and which were central. And slowly, without realizing it at first, the fear that had paralyzed him began to change shape. It did not disappear, but it sharpened into something else. Awareness, purpose, a dangerous clarity. He knew that if he survived this place, he would not leave unchanged. He also knew that what he was seeing could not be unseen. The wrong turn he had taken had placed him inside the enemy's mind, and whether he wanted it or not, that knowledge came with responsibility. Somewhere beyond the forest, his mother waited, unaware that her son was sleeping among the people who controlled her fate. By the end of the second week, the officer who had first spoken to him called him aside again. He asked if the boy understood where he was and what could happen if he spoke about it. The boy nodded. The officer then said something quietly, something that sent a chill through him. He said that sometimes history moves through the smallest hands, and that survival often depends on knowing when to stay silent and when to act. That night, lying awake once more, the boy realized the truth he had been avoiding. He was no longer just trapped inside a Nazi headquarters. He was standing at the edge of a choice that could cost him his life or give it meaning. The wrong turn had not ended his story. It had only begun it. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It crept into him slowly, settling in the quiet moments when no one was watching. When he stood near doorways holding papers he could not read aloud. When he waited outside rooms where decisions were being made and voices lowered, just enough to suggest secrecy, he began to understand that survival inside that place did not come from strength or courage, but from invisibility. The less remarkable he seemed, the longer he lived. And yet, the more invisible he became, the more he saw. He learned to listen without appearing to listen. Officers talked freely around him, assuming a boy with a broom or a stack of folders could not possibly understand the weight of their words. He heard dates mentioned, movements planned, warnings dismissed with confidence. He learned how often arrogance replaced caution. Each detail lodged itself into his memory, not because he intended to use it, but because once you hear such things, forgetting becomes impossible. Knowledge has a way of rooting itself deep, especially when it carries the sound of footsteps marching toward destruction. Sometimes he would be sent to stand near radios while messages crackled through static. He did not understand every word, but patterns emerged. Locations repeated, names returned. The war began to feel smaller, more contained, as if it were being folded inward onto the maps he saw every day. And in that shrinking world, he could see how a single piece of information, moved quietly from one place to another, could change everything. At night, sleep came in fragments. Dreams were filled with roads that split endlessly, each choice leading to another mistake. He saw his mother's face in these dreams, not crying, but waiting, always waiting, as if she knew time itself had slowed for him. He wondered how many nights she had already spent staring at the door, listening for footsteps that did not come. The thought burned in his chest, fueling a guilt that never fully faded. One evening, while cleaning a corridor outside a meeting room, he overheard something that made his breath catch. A name was mentioned, followed by a village. His village. The officer speaking referred to it casually, as if it were just another point on a map, another task to be handled in the coming days. He spoke of inspections, of cooperation, of consequences if cooperation failed. The words were not shouted. They were delivered calmly, efficiently, which made them more terrifying than threats ever could. The boy stood frozen long after the voices faded, the broom forgotten in his hands. He understood then that the danger was no longer abstract. It was not somewhere far away, happening to other people. It was moving closer, directed by the very place he now walked through daily. The wrong turn he had taken had not only placed him inside the enemy's headquarters, it had placed his home in their path. From that moment on, everything changed. His listening was no longer passive. His memory sharpened with urgency. He began to track conversations, connecting fragments across days, building a picture of what was coming. He did not yet know how he would act on this knowledge, only that doing nothing was no longer an option. Fear still lived in him, but it was no longer the loudest voice. Responsibility had begun to speak louder. Opportunity came quietly, as most dangerous opportunities do. One afternoon, he was sent to deliver documents between buildings, unaccompanied for the first time. The guards recognized him now, waved him through without suspicion. Familiarity had done its work. He noticed a map left unattended on a table near an open window, marked with symbols he had seen before. His heart raced as he pretended to adjust the stack of papers in his hands. Stealing a glance, then another, he memorized what he could in seconds, forcing himself not to stare too long. Dates, arrows, locations. Enough to confirm what he already feared. Enough to know that time was running out. When he walked away, his legs felt weak, but his mind was clear. He now carried something far more dangerous than the paper he had brought with him weeks earlier. The problem was escape. The headquarters was no longer just a place he could walk out of. He was watched, even if casually. Every routine had eyes. Every path had a memory. Leaving suddenly would raise questions. Questions led to answers extracted in ways he did not want to imagine. He needed a reason. He needed patience. He needed luck. That night, as rain began to fall softly against the roof, the officer who had first evaluated him called him in again. He spoke about trust, about usefulness, about how the boy had adapted well. He said that arrangements were being made for the boy to return home temporarily, to reassure his family, to maintain appearances. The words sounded generous, but the meaning beneath them was clear. They wanted to see if he would return. They wanted to know where his loyalties lay. The boy kept his face neutral as relief and fear collided inside him. A chance to leave meant a chance to warn others. It also meant walking back into danger willingly if he chose to return. He nodded, thanked the officer, and accepted the instructions given to him. Every detail mattered now. Routes, timing, what he could say and what he could not. When he finally stepped back onto the forest road days later, the air felt unreal against his skin. Freedom, even temporary, carried a strange weight. He walked carefully, resisting the urge to run, knowing eyes might still be watching from somewhere unseen. Only when the trees thickened and the road softened beneath his feet did he allow himself to breathe fully. As he approached the outskirts of his village, he saw how little had changed and how much had. People moved cautiously, heads lowered, life continuing in quiet defiance. His mother stood in the doorway when she saw him, frozen for a heartbeat before crossing the distance between them. She held him tightly, saying nothing, as if words might break the moment apart. He felt her hands tremble, felt how thin she had become, and the guilt he carried deepened. That night, in whispers barely louder than breath, he told what he could to those who needed to know. Not everything, never everything, just enough. Names, timing, warnings shaped carefully so they would travel safely. He did not stay long. Before dawn, he was gone again, walking back toward the place he now understood better than any map ever could. As he retraced his steps toward the headquarters, the boy understood the truth of what he had become. He was no longer simply a victim of a wrong turn. He was a thread woven into the fabric of the war itself, pulled tight between fear and purpose. And somewhere ahead, consequences waited, patient and unavoidable, ready to claim their price. When you are ready, say continue part 4. And I will conclude the story with the aftermath, the cost, and the legacy of that single wrong turn. Staying fully paragraph-based and emotionally grounded. The boy kept his face neutral as relief and fear collided inside him. A chance to leave meant a chance to warn others. It also meant walking back into danger willingly if he chose to return. He nodded, thanked the officer, and accepted the instructions given to him. Every detail mattered now. Routes, timing, what he could say and what he could not. When he finally stepped back onto the forest road days later, the air felt unreal against his skin. Freedom, even temporary, carried a strange weight. He walked carefully, resisting the urge to run, knowing eyes might still be watching from somewhere unseen. Only when the trees thickened and the road softened beneath his feet did he allow himself to breathe fully. As he approached the outskirts of his village, he saw how little had changed and how much had. People moved cautiously, heads lowered, life continuing in quiet defiance. His mother stood in the doorway when she saw him, frozen for a heartbeat before crossing the distance between them. She held him tightly, saying nothing, as if words might break the moment apart. He felt her hands tremble, felt how thin she had become, and the guilt he carried deepened. That night, in whispers barely louder than breath, he told what he could to those who needed to know. Not everything, never everything, just enough. Names, timing, warnings shaped carefully so they would travel safely. He did not stay long. Before dawn, he was gone again, walking back toward the place he now understood better than any map ever could. As he retraced his steps toward the headquarters, the boy understood the truth of what he had become. He was no longer simply a victim of a wrong turn. He was a thread woven into the fabric of the war itself, pulled tight between fear and purpose. And somewhere ahead, consequences waited, patient and unavoidable, ready to claim their price. When you are ready, say continue part 4. And I will conclude the story with the aftermath, the cost, and the legacy of that single wrong turn. staying fully paragraph-based and emotionally grounded. A few days later, the officer who had first taken interest in him called him in once more. The man's calm was gone now, replaced by something colder, more focused. He asked questions again, not the same ones as before. Questions about the village, about who the boy spoke to when he returned home, about what he had seen and heard beyond the forest. Each question felt like a tightening circle. The boy answered carefully, truth wrapped in simplicity, nothing more. He spoke of his mother, of bread, of silence. He offered nothing that could be pulled apart and used against him. The officer watched him closely, searching for cracks that never appeared. Finally, he leaned back and said that the war had taught him one thing above all others, that the smallest movements often caused the greatest disruptions. For a moment, the boy thought it was over, that this was where his story ended, quietly, without witnesses. But the officer dismissed him instead, eyes unreadable, as if still undecided. Walking out of that room, the boy felt something break loose inside him. He understood that he had reached the edge of his luck. Not long after, the headquarters began to change. Supplies were reduced. Personnel shifted. Some officers left and did not return. Rumors spread in fragments, spoken only when necessary. The war was turning, slowly but undeniably. In places like this one could feel it first. Control was slipping, and with it, certainty. The boy was released weeks later, not dramatically, not with apologies or explanations. He was simply told he was no longer needed. No escort followed him beyond the forest this time. No one watched to see where he went. He walked away carrying nothing but memory and the knowledge that he had survived something that should have killed him many times over. When he returned home for the last time, the village felt quieter than ever. Some people were gone. Others had aged years and months. His mother held him again, longer this time, as if refusing to let go might undo the damage already done. He never told her everything. He never told anyone everything. Some truths are too heavy to pass on. Years later, long after the war ended and borders shifted again, he would still remember that crossroads. He would remember the moment he chose left instead of right, and how that single decision carried him into the heart of darkness. He would understand then that history is not only shaped by generals and battles, but by frightened teenagers, by whispered warnings, by wrong turns taken at the exact moment they were needed. He lived a quiet life after the war. No medals, no recognition, just memory. But somewhere, lives had been saved, paths altered, outcomes changed because a 16-year-old walked into a place he was never meant to see and chose to pay attention instead of looking away. The world would never know his name, and that was exactly how it had to be. Because some stories are not meant to be celebrated. They are meant to be remembered quietly, as proof that even in the darkest systems ever built, a single human choice can still matter. And it all began with a wrong turn.